You've probably seen the photograph by now. Most people following this case have. It's the front porch of Nancy Guthrie's home in Tucson, tiles warmed by desert sun during the day, now frozen in time for a very different reason. There's blood on them. Not a smear, not chaos exactly, but something quieter. Drops. A trail. The kind your eye follows without realizing you're doing it. Before we go any further, do me a quick favor. Drop your location in the comments. I always find it grounding to see where people are watching from, especially on stories like this that seem to pull attention from everywhere at once. It reminds you this isn't just local anymore. It's become something larger. Now look, most people reacted to that image the same way. You see blood on the front step of an 84-year-old woman's home, and your brain doesn't go into analysis mode. It goes straight to emotion. It's unsettling. It feels wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. And honestly, that reaction makes sense. But here's the thing, the emotional reaction doesn't actually tell you anything about what happened. The blood does. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how easy it is to miss that. Because to a trained eye, blood isn't just evidence. It's a sequence. It's physics playing out in real time. Every drop has weight, direction, timing. It lands the way it does for a reason, and if you know how to read it, it's almost like flipping through a set of still frames from a video no one actually saw. And for 53 days, investigators, especially those at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, have been doing exactly that, reading it, interpreting it, quietly building a version of events that the rest of the public only just started to understand. Because this week, something shifted. Not in the sense that new evidence suddenly appeared, but in the sense that the existing evidence finally got translated into something the rest of us could follow. So let's slow this down and start where they started. Bloodstain pattern analysis isn't new. It's been around for over a century, and at its core, it's based on something pretty straightforward. Liquid behaves predictably. Doesn't matter who it comes from. Doesn't matter the situation. A drop of blood follows the same physical rules every time it falls. Which means when it hits a surface, it leaves behind a kind of signature. The shape tells you how fast it was moving. The edges tell you whether it fell from high up or close to the ground. The spacing between drops tells you whether the source was moving and how fast. Even the texture, the density, all of it builds a picture. But here, where it gets more specific. Not all blood drops are the same. A cut on the arm produces one kind of pattern. A head wound produces another. And then there's something else entirely, blood that's been mixed with air. That's the kind that behaves differently, looks different, and, if you know what you're seeing, points to a very particular source. That's what caught the attention of Michael Baden. Now Baden isn't just any analyst. Former chief medical examiner of New York City, decades of experience, the kind of person who's looked at more crime scenes than most people could even imagine. And when he looked at the publicly available photos of Nancy's porch, he noticed something that, apparently, a lot of people missed. The drops weren't solid. They had pale centers, almost like tiny rings, donut shapes. At first glance, that might not sound like much. But in forensic terms, it's specific, really specific, because when blood falls as a pure liquid, say, from a cut, it hits the ground and spreads evenly. Solid center, consistent edges. But when it's mixed with air, everything changes. That air creates a kind of hollow effect as the drop lands. You end up with that pale center, that ring shape. And that doesn't happen randomly. It happens when blood is coming from the nose or the mouth, places where it's interacting with breath, with airflow, with the mechanics of someone trying to breathe. So Baden looked at those drops and said, essentially, this isn't just bleeding. This is someone either coughing up blood or bleeding from the face. And that's the moment where the whole picture starts to shift. Because an 84-year-old woman doesn't just step outside in the middle of the night and start coughing up blood on her porch. That kind of bleeding has a cause, usually a physical one. A blow to the face, pressure on the airway, something that disrupts normal breathing and forces blood into places it shouldn't be. I keep coming back to that detail, mixed with air. It's such a small phrase, but it changes everything. Because it suggests movement, distress, a body reacting to something happening in real time. And then Baden adds another layer to it. He points out that the pattern and placement of those drops suggests something else. Nancy wasn't stopping the bleeding. Now think about that for a second. If you or I started bleeding from the nose or mouth, what's the first thing we'd do? Instinctively, without even thinking, we'd reach up, try to stop it, wipe it away, apply pressure, something. But that didn't happen here. The blood falls in a way that suggests it wasn't interrupted. No attempts to contain it. No signs of someone pausing to react. Which leaves you with two possibilities, and neither of them sits well. Either she couldn't stop it, or she didn't. If she couldn't, that implies restraint. Her hands weren't free. Something or someone was preventing her from reacting. And if she didn't, then you're looking at someone who was either unconscious or so compromised that basic reflexes weren't kicking in. Either way, she wasn't in control. And that's before you even get to the direction of the trail. Because the blood doesn't just sit on the porch, it leads somewhere. Subtle but consistent. A movement from the front of the house outward toward the driveway. Not chaotic, not scattered, but intentional, in the way physics is always intentional. Now here, where another voice comes in, Jim Clement, a retired FBI supervisory special agent. He looked at the same pattern and pointed out something that cuts through a lot of speculation. These aren't drag marks. There are no smears, no signs of a body being pulled. What you see instead are drip stains, drops falling from a height, spaced in a way that suggests forward movement. Which means, at least at that moment, Nancy was alive. That's not a dramatic statement. It's actually a very measured one. Because in forensic terms, a body being dragged leaves a completely different kind of trace. Smears, transfers, irregular patterns where contact is constant. That's not what's here. What's here is intermittent, drops, gravity doing its thing between steps or movements. So Clement looks at it and says, essentially, this looks like someone who was moving and bleeding, not someone who had already died inside the house. And I keep circling back to that idea, because it reframes the entire case. If she was alive when that blood hit the porch, then whatever happened didn't end inside the house. It extended beyond it, into the open, into that space between the front door and the driveway. And maybe more importantly, it means, at that point in time, this wasn't just a disappearance. It was something still in motion. Now, before we move further, and we will, because there's a piece of information that changes the timeline in a pretty significant way, just take a second and look at the porch again in your mind. Not as a shocking image, not as something to react to, but as something to read. Because what's sitting there isn't random, it's structured, intentional in the way only physical evidence can be. And the strange part is, for weeks, everyone was looking at it, just not seeing it. There's a detail in this case that didn't surface right away, not because it wasn't known, but because it stayed for a while just beneath the surface of public conversation. And when it finally came out, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt clarifying. Because up until that point, most of the attention had been focused on what was outside. The porch, the driveway, the visible trail, everything people could point to and say, this is where something went wrong. But here's the thing. What happens outside only makes sense once you understand what started inside. That shift came through reporting from Ashley Banfield. She'd been following this case closely, talking to sources early, the kind of early where information is still being sorted out and verified in real time. And according to her, something significant had been known since day 3 of the investigation. There was blood inside the house. Now pause there for a second, because that changes the framing immediately. This wasn't a situation where someone stepped out onto the porch and something happened spontaneously. This wasn't an event that began at the doorway or just beyond it. If there's blood inside, especially near the entrance, then whatever caused that bleeding started before Nancy ever reached the door. Banfield didn't just mention it once. She said she had two sources confirming it. The first flagged it almost immediately, just days into the case. The second reinforced it later, more definitively. And then came the part that, honestly, feels easy to overlook but really shouldn't be. The blood inside wasn't random. It was located just past the front door. And more importantly, its pattern matched what was found outside. So now you're not looking at two separate events. You're looking at one continuous sequence. Inside, through the doorway, onto the porch. I keep thinking about that transition point, the threshold, because thresholds are strange places in any investigation. They're where environments change, inside to outside, private space to public view, and in this case, it's also where a narrative becomes visible. According to Banfield's reporting, the trail didn't start on the porch. It crossed onto it. Which means by the time Nancy reached that door, or was brought to it, the bleeding had already begun. And that raises a question that's hard to ignore. What happened in those few feet inside the house? We don't have a full reconstruction of that interior scene. Not publicly, anyway. But we do have reactions from the first responders, and those reactions matter more than people sometimes realize. When deputies from Pima County Sheriff's Department initially arrived, they weren't walking into what they thought was a violent crime. At least not at first. The call was for a missing elderly woman, someone who hadn't shown up where she was expected. That kind of call happens more often than you'd think, and it doesn't always mean something sinister. But then they saw something. We don't know exactly what, not in full detail, but we know it was enough to change the trajectory of the response. Because instead of continuing with a standard missing persons approach, they called in homicide investigators. That's not a small decision. Departments don't escalate like that without a reason. It takes something concrete, something that suggests the possibility of violence, not just absence. And in this case, that something appears to have been tied directly to what was found just inside the home. Blood. Not a large pool, at least from what's been described publicly, but enough to signal that this wasn't a situation where someone simply wandered off. And here, where it gets interesting, maybe even a little counterintuitive. The blood inside and the blood outside aren't just connected spatially. They're connected structurally. Same kind of drops, same pattern characteristics, which means whatever was causing the bleeding didn't change as Nancy moved, or was moved, from inside to outside. It was continuous. There wasn't a pause. There wasn't a moment where the bleeding stopped and then started again. The physics of it doesn't support that. What it supports is a steady progression. And that progression tells a story. It starts somewhere inside the house, likely near that front entry area. Something happens. An impact maybe, pressure. Something that leads to blood from the nose or mouth, the kind mixed with air that we talked about earlier. And then from that point forward, every step or every movement carries that evidence forward. Through the doorway. Out onto the porch. Toward the driveway. I'm still trying to reconcile how quiet that kind of sequence would be. Because when people imagine incidents like this, there's often an assumption of noise, of chaos. But the physical evidence here doesn't necessarily point to that. It points to control, to movement that's directed, even if it's forced. And then there's the timeline. For weeks, the public conversation circled around the porch as the central location. The visible evidence anchored everything there. But once you introduce the interior blood, the timeline stretches backward. The porch becomes just one segment of a longer chain. And that matters to investigators a lot. Because when you can establish directionality, when you know where something started and where it moved, You're no longer guessing about sequence. You're reading it. Blood doesn't reverse direction. It doesn't double back unless something physically causes it to. So if the trail leads from inside to outside, that's the order of events. Inside first, then the threshold, then the exterior, and then nothing. That last part is what lingers, because the trail doesn't continue indefinitely. It reaches a point, somewhere near the driveway, and then it stops. Not fades gradually, but stops in a way that suggests a change, a transition from one phase to another. What happened at that point isn't written in the same way the earlier moments are. There's less to read, fewer clues in plain sight, but the lead up to it, that's detailed, almost methodical. And when you layer this with what the analysts were already saying, the type of blood, the lack of interruption, the indication that Nancy wasn't stopping the bleeding, you start to see a more complete picture forming. Not all at once, not neatly, but piece by piece. Inside, something initiates the bleeding. At the threshold, the movement continues. Outside, the pattern becomes visible enough for the rest of us to notice. And throughout all of it, the physical evidence stays consistent. Which, if you think about it, is both helpful and unsettling. Helpful because consistency makes analysis stronger. Unsettling because it suggests there wasn't a break in whatever was happening. No interruption. No moment where things de-escalated. Just continuation. Anyway, this is the point in the case where the focus shifts again. Because once you understand that the event started inside and moved outward, the next question becomes less about where and more about how. How was she moving? Was she walking? Was she being guided? Or was something else happening entirely? And that's where the next layer of analysis comes in. One that doesn't just look at where the blood is, but what's missing from it. And strangely enough, what's missing might be the most telling part of all. So by now, the outline is starting to take shape. We know the blood begins inside the house and continues outward. We know from the shape of the drops that it's likely coming from the nose or mouth, blood mixed with air, not a simple cut. And we know, at least at the moment those drops were landing on the porch, Nancy Guthrie was alive. But there's a gap in all of that. Not a gap in the timeline. Those pieces are actually lining up more clearly than they were a few weeks ago. No, this is something else. It's a gap in the pattern itself. Or more accurately, the absence of something that should be there. Because if someone is bleeding and moving across a surface like that porch, you'd expect to see evidence of how they were moving. Not just direction, but contact, interaction with the ground. Footsteps. Interruptions. What analysts call voids. That's where Mary Ellen O'Toole, who spent years working behavioral and forensic cases, steps in alongside observations echoed by other former agents like Maureen O'Connell. When they looked at the porch photos, they weren't just paying attention to what was there. They were looking for what wasn't. And what wasn't there were voids. Let me explain that in plain terms. When blood is falling, drop by drop, and someone is walking through it, their feet interrupt that pattern. Every step creates a small absence, a place where a drop should have landed but didn't because a shoe or a foot got there first. Those absences form a pattern of their own. You can map stride length, direction, even speed just from those interruptions. But on Nancy's porch, analysts didn't see that. No clear gaps, no consistent disruptions, just drops landing cleanly, uninterrupted across the tiles. And I keep coming back to how specific that is, because it's not ambiguous. It's not something that could go either way depending on interpretation. If someone is walking through active bleeding, you will see voids. Unless their feet aren't touching the ground. That's the conclusion O'Connell reached, pretty directly. She looked at the concentration and distribution of the drops and said, essentially, this doesn't look like someone walking out of the house. It looks like someone being carried. Now, that's the kind of statement that can sound dramatic if you just hear it out of context. But when you place it next to everything else, the air-mixed blood, the continuous trail from inside to outside, the lack of any attempt to stop the bleeding, it doesn't feel like a leap. It feels like the next logical step. Because if Nancy wasn't walking, then her movement from inside the house to the porch wasn't voluntary. It wasn't assisted in the way you'd guide someone by the arm. It was controlled, lifted, managed by someone else. And once you accept that, a lot of smaller details start to click into place. Take the height of the blood drops, for example. That analysis came from Amy Santoro, who reviewed the publicly available footage and pointed out that the drops appear to be falling from more than 2 feet above the ground. Now, 2 feet might not sound like much, but in this context it matters, because it tells you the source of the bleeding wasn't near the floor. It wasn't someone lying down or being dragged. It was elevated, roughly at the height you'd expect if someone were being held or carried, with their upper body off the ground. Santoro also noted something else, something that's easy to miss if you're only looking casually. The volume and spacing of the drops suggest a relatively fast bleed, not something slow or intermittent, but active, ongoing, enough to leave a visible trail over a short distance. So now you've got this combination: elevated source, continuous movement, no footstep interruptions. And it starts to form a very specific image. Someone carrying a person who is bleeding from the face or mouth, moving from inside the house, through the doorway, and out onto the porch. Which brings us to the doorway itself. Because doorways in real life are awkward. They're obstacles, especially if you're trying to move through them while holding something heavy, let alone someone. And in Nancy's case, it's not just one barrier. There's the main door, and then there's an exterior security gate. 2 separate points where movement has to slow down, adjust. O'Connell offered a theory here, not as a confirmed sequence, but as a reconstruction based on how bodies move and how environments constrain that movement. She suggested that Nancy may have been wrapped in something, held close to the person carrying her. And as they reached the door, they would have had to shift their grip. Maybe back up to open it. Maybe reposition to get through the gate. And in one of those moments, just briefly, the positioning changes. The head turns, the angle shifts. And that's when the blood falls. Straight down. Not smeared, not cast outward. Just gravity doing its job in a moment where control slips, even slightly. I'm not saying that's exactly how it happened. None of these experts are claiming certainty at that level. But what's interesting is how well that scenario aligns with everything else we're seeing. The type of blood, the height, the lack of voids, the direction of the trail. Different analysts, different disciplines, all pointing toward a version of events that, piece by piece, fits together. And then you get to the part that's harder to pin down, the end of the trail. Because it doesn't go on forever. It reaches a point near the driveway and then it stops. No clear continuation beyond that. No obvious extension that's been made public, at least. And that's where the physical evidence starts to give way to inference. Something changes at that point. Maybe a vehicle, maybe a shift in how Nancy was being transported, maybe something else entirely. But whatever it is, it marks the end of what the blood can directly tell us. Up to that point, though, it's surprisingly detailed. It tells investigators where the event started, inside the house. It tells them the likely nature of the injury, blood from the face or mouth. It tells them Nancy was alive during that movement. It suggests she wasn't walking. And it points to moments where the person moving her had to adjust, had to manage the physical reality of getting through that space. That's a lot when you think about it, all from something most people initially saw as just a disturbing image. And here's the part I keep circling back to. Whoever did this, if we assume someone did, probably wasn't thinking about blood in those terms. They were thinking about speed, about getting in and out, about not being seen. But blood doesn't operate on intention. It operates on physics. You can plan around a lot of things: timing, visibility, even access. But you can't negotiate with gravity. And what's left behind on that porch is a kind of record of that reality. Not perfect, not complete, but structured enough that, weeks later, people who have never set foot in that house can start to piece together what might have happened in those few minutes. Which brings me to something I can't quite shake. If the blood tells us this much, about movement, about injury, about sequence, what else is sitting in that scene that hasn't been made public yet? And more importantly, what did the person responsible think they'd managed to hide?